Hello and welcome to yet another lecture, lecture number 12. In the past couple of lectures, we have been talking about the increasing move towards public health as opposed to concern with enclaves, and in that context, we have been talking considerably about sanitary measures. Even as sanitary measures were introduced, sanitary commissioners were introduced, it was also felt that there should be some measure of sanitary education. So today we will talk about that and also other related aspects like the vital role of vital statistics in dealing with public health, and of course epidemics, which provided a huge propelling force for public health to really take off and to get really serious. So let's start with sanitary education. So the colonial government, as it ventured into public health, recognized the importance of educating that very public about basic sanitary practices to prevent, to mitigate the spread of infectious diseases. So, how this could be done was through a variety of means, which included issuing of pamphlets, posters, conducting public lectures, and including a bit of sanitary education in the general school curriculum. But the effectiveness of all this was limited by various factors, including widespread illiteracy, general illiteracy, and cultural practices which were seen to be incompatible with Western notions of hygiene. So, for instance, it would be difficult for people to come to terms with the idea of avoiding the use of the local pond or the river for bathing and using the same river for washing and washing of cattle and other such things, which would be very unhygienic from Western point of view, but would be very difficult to negotiate culturally at the local level with the local population. And also false views about inoculation and whatever other beneficial sanitary measures that were introduced. It was as there were always people to spread rumors for whatever vested interest. These rumors would find fertile ground in a situation where there is large scale illiteracy or ignorance. So, illiteracy had its own difficulties and presented quite a lot of difficulties and problems in these health measures. So, again, as we see, like medicine is related to a whole variety of other factors, as we've been repeatedly saying. So, the level of education, literacy also matters apart from broader cultural and political and economic matters. And also, there wasn't really dedicated government maintained school in India to provide systematic instruction in hygiene itself. Of course, catechism of hygiene was introduced, and of course that was also as late as 1908. So this catechism was to be used in elementary schools, and the provision for teaching of sanitary science at all levels was introduced even much later in 1914. And also the same year, there was also provision to do medical inspection of school children. And this was done on an experimental basis. Of course, these days we are very familiar with this. At least once a year, there is a medical camp or medical inspection day or week in schools when all the children are examined, and so each school child has a medical record, so which is periodically updated. So something of this kind was started. So in 1914, and in Bombay, that was placed on a permanent footing in 1917, but as in many other cases, with inadequate staffing, with just 2 inspectors. Along with sanitary education, there was another important movement, which is also an important arm of public health, the evolving public health system. So that was the dispensary movement, which was crucial, as I said, to the public health infrastructure. It was initiated in the mid 19th century, basically by establishing dispensaries in cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. The idea was to provide medical care to the poor and the underprivileged, the kinds of people who couldn't afford private medical treatment, like unlike the rich babus or other wealthy people who can have the attention and treatment of either Western or Indian practitioners of either kind, either trained in Western medicine or high class Indian traditional medicine. So, this dispensaries were, and it's quite fitting because we are talking about public health and a place where the wider public could go, and so this could happen through the collective work of government officials, philanthropists, and medical practitioners. And the role of philanthropists is something which we will keep bringing up from time to time. In fact, there will be a exclusive lecture on the role of philanthropy and philanthropists. But it's important to bear in mind that the British were quite used to back home with this system of benefactors playing a big role in promoting medicine and making provisions for asylums and dispensaries like these. And the important point to be noted is that they did expect the same kind of benevolence, philanthropy from locals here, and you can understand that in the context of what we have been saying very often, that reluctance to spend. So one of the ways they thought the compensation could come was through the involvement of private players, the local wealthy, who would show particular philanthropy towards medicine. So, and of course, it was not entirely absent, as you can see, like in cases like this, and in certain other even bigger cases, we will see the role of philanthropy. The medical practitioners who were employed in the dispensaries had a variety of functions, so they were not just doling out tablets and other forms of cures. So they were expected to promote basic sanitary practices like cleanliness, proper ventilation, the safe disposal of waste, and other such things. So we have to bear in mind this is all in the context of the broader sanitary movement, which in turn is connected to the broader environmental paradigm under which diseases were understood. So you should constantly keep all those things in the background. So these practitioners were also responsible for the early detection and treatment of diseases, as well as that is a curative function, but also they had a role in the preventive function as well. So they had to implement preventive measures such as quarantine and vaccination. And so, as I said, so all this was linked to the broader goal of sanitary reform and public education. And in this way, they played a very important role in controlling, mitigating the spread of infectious diseases such as cholera, smallpox, plague, other such. They also the dispensaries played a very key role in developing the Indian medical profession by providing opportunities for Indian medical graduates to gain practical experience and establish themselves in the field by a period of service in these kinds of dispensaries, which provided, so as you know, like most serious medical colleges also have a hospital. So it's not only to dole out medical care to the people, but there's also enough and diverse cases for them available to study, to educate themselves on the all possible kinds of cases which would come later on when they go out into private or other practice. So these dispensaries provided those kinds of cases where so many from the public would come with so many different kinds of afflictions. So I put together the dispensary movement and the sanitary education, apart from all the other broad sanitary measures, played a very important role in laying the foundations for public health in India and providing a framework for medical care and provision of basic sanitary practices, which have left a legacy, many of which continue, or at least some of the shadows are there. So that at least that framework has been enduring with necessary modifications from time to time. And one other dimension of the emerging public health is the role of numbers. And as we will be discussing in tutorial, um, enumeration, statistics, or broadly knowledge, organized knowledge, was very crucial not only in the field of medicine but in the general colonial order. The importance and power of knowledge, we will be discussing at length about that in that tutorial. So, but it's enough to say here that that same concern about knowing as much as possible, understanding as much as possible, was evident here in the field of medicine as well. And so the system of vital statistics was started to provide annual aggregate of various aspects of the Indian civil population or the general population, as opposed to enclaves like the army or asylums. So the data expectedly was used to analyze and identify patterns and trends in mortality and morbidity, and accordingly work out strategies for prevention of diseases and control of rates of mortality and morbidity. And it was also used to evaluate the efficacy of measures like vaccination by comparing the death rates before the vaccination in the same as given place and the death rate after vaccination at some year or over a period of time. So that would give more scientific, reliable knowledge, confidence about the efficacy of the vaccines or any other such thing that was being tried. The first such large scale vital statistical report was released in 1864, which covered the data of the previous 10 years. And some of the signs, messages from the statistics like this was that India showed a very high death rate compared to Europe, and among the major reasons for high mortality were diseases such as cholera and smallpox. One of the other things which was introduced as part of this enumeration and collection of statistics was the practice of registration. So, as far as cantonments were concerned, there was the Military Cantonment Acts of 1864, which sanctioned the registration of the deaths in cantonments. The provincial sanitary commissions, as you know, like each province had its own sanitary commission. So, apart from the other works, so there's a new work now related to public health, so which was to register the deaths in the civilian sphere from 1860s. So considerable investments were made to improve the system of registration by establishing new offices for registration and standardizing the reporting procedures. And also, and since this was something very new and something for which people can't be brought from back home in Britain, so local personnel or even medical personnel were already there, so had to be specially trained for this kind of work. And some officers were specially appointed by the municipality or cantonment committee to register deaths in towns. So, death registration in the countryside was to be done at the police level with the chief police officer or the circle registration officer, village headmen also had a very important role here. So they were responsible for reporting deaths to the registration officer. And in doing so, they had to classify the entries according to the race, religion. They had to give the cause of death and age, roughly approximating 5 and 10 years. And of course, with the name of the village, that there were, as in any system, there will be difficulties here, and especially something totally new as is introduced. So there was difficulty in coordinating the registration office. So you see people operating at different levels. So at the level of civil surgeon, who would have a particular kind of attitude, a particular kind of interest and seriousness towards this kind of work, to a Indian subordinate police whose attitude and priorities different. So those clash of attitudes, apart from the long chain of officers, so those could explain the difficulties of coordination. Jails and lunatic asylums, as enclosed, as I said in other lectures, so there's a special kind of enclave. So they had their own separate returns. And so here you see the Army Sanitary Commission urging all large cities in India to produce weekly returns of deaths, because the high rates of cholera among the European troops in 1817 was a cause for concern. So that's why. So this is about. So here we are not talking about the army areas, but the Army Sanitary Commission is asking for reports, weekly reports from non-army areas, because as we know, cholera from the wider civilian sphere was becoming a challenge and caused huge mortality, even higher mortality rate among the Europeans. So the Army Sanitary Commission asked for these kinds of weekly returns from the civilian spaces. Some provincial governments like Punjab and CP, central provinces, and there are accepted, but certain others murmured. They were talking about the impossibility of publishing reports more frequently than on a monthly basis, because here, as you say, they're asking on a weekly basis. So the minimum they could do is on a monthly basis. And again, so one of the reasons given was there wasn't enough finance to do it at that kind of a frequency, particularly financial support from the central government to hire adequate number of staff for this kind of work. And therefore, overall, though there was some clear utility in these measures, new systems, but they were far from satisfactory, even within the cantonments. There was a call for compulsory registration from the concerned families, inhabitants themselves, but little progress could be made, according to the Sanitary Commission, despite the clause added in the cantonment regulations in 1869, mandating that the head of every family should report deaths in the household within 24 hours. And also in the civilian sphere, the compulsion was made only in a small number of municipalities, and there too the results were not uniformly positive. And other reasons for the unsatisfactory nature of this enterprise was the insufficient availability of medical practitioners, the ignorance and apathy of the public who wouldn't care too much to be interested in these, and also the village officials who weren't always all that serious and responsible. And also it was very difficult for the medical men, given their own training, so these were not men who were trained in demography and statistics. So it was also very difficult for them to do to ascertain those kinds of demographic trends, though they did attempt some kind of rough estimates from time to time. The health officers also complained about the Indian police, who were in charge of registration of deaths, about their consistent failure to report deaths properly or even to fill the forms properly. And so as usual, so when something new is introduced, there will be some kind of issue, shortcomings, and then again there will be some kinds of efforts at fixing. So one such in this case was by removing the responsibility of registration from the police and putting it under the control of civil surgeons, because as I said, civil surgeons would have some more involvement and different kind of understanding. So therefore, they would demand a higher standard of medical accuracy from their subordinates. But medical men, so as we had seen in other lectures, so medicine as such as involved in the public health scenario was, as it is, very bureaucratic. And so these kinds of works were only extra, more of a bureaucratic burden in addition to their administrative work. One other method tried was to relieve the sanitary commissioners of some statistical work so that they could do more of registration work. And all said and done, the government of India was reluctant to press registration as compulsory, and so it directed the cantonments and municipalities not to enforce them in ways that antagonize indigenous population. So you see this point coming again and again. Apart from a medical point of view, how would any of these things impact on the public, their sensibilities, whether the state could expect to have their full cooperation, or is there a possibility that these kinds of activities, measures would rub on the wrong side? So that was always there. So you've already seen in this issue arising in several issues that will always be there on the background. And so 1857 will always be remembered. Of course, 1857 was not caused only because of this, but suspected these kinds of cultural intrusions across the board, not only through medicine, was one of the reasons for the uprising, though it involved other kinds of issues like the interests of feudal elements and all that. But certainly, one of the reasons for 1857 was felt to be the kind of reaction against several forms of intrusion. So it was best left to the local officials who are there on the ground to judge the pulse, and based on the kinds of discontent or satisfaction or cooperation, they can take a decision. And further challenges in implementing the vital statistics system was that the provincial governments, except Bombay, resisted appeals by the Indian Famine Commission. Of course, so one of the recurring things in the colonial period was the periodic famines. And then, as I was saying in another lecture, for everything there is a commission. So for famines also there were commissions. And in one of the reports, the Famine Commission insisted that there should be compulsory registration, but only the government of Bombay warmed up to it. And it continued to be the only provincial government to permit the introduction of compulsory registration even in rural areas, though it acknowledged slowness of its progress in the 1890s. And another important reason was the lack of infrastructure and trained personnel, lack of registration offices in several areas, and also differential forms, variation in quality of data collection, even if they were collected. And the system's reliance on subordinate police, who, as I said, have other kinds of mentality and other kinds of things which interest them more. And on top of that, they didn't even have a rudimentary medical knowledge. So all of these were problematic in the long run. And finally, we will close this lecture by giving just an introduction to the question of diseases at large, because as I said, this whole question of public health going to the public beyond enclaves was to a great extent propelled by the very challenging incidents of some really difficult diseases like smallpox and others. So diseases, for good or bad, so these diseases uh, had an important role in shaping up all the sanitary measures and the evolving of the public health infrastructures. So diseases based on their spread, as most of us know, be classified as ones that are endemic, which are confined to a particular region, and epidemic, which spread over a large population, and particularly to be noted is the speed at which it spreads and the time, in a very short time, spreading to a considerable geographical area. And pandemic, we have gone through one recently, the COVID pandemic. So it spread across several regions of the world, if not the entire world. And so one of the earliest, uh, and which we'll be discussing in detail, is cholera, the cholera disease, and its mortality remained very high in spite of several measures. And apart from cholera, there was a plague and malaria, and so these were not all one-time affairs. So there was successive bouts of these diseases resulted in, by the time the 19th century came to an end, so it was an awful number of people, the statistics revealed, who had died by one or the other kind of this diseases. And so these were caused by several reasons. So one was poverty, and as I said, the famine particularly induced by the colonial mode of rule and exploitation, unorganized and unplanned urban growth, which had problems of hygiene, the spread of slums, and certain activities which were particularly related to the colonial mode of rule, colonial ambitions, colonial expansionist policies, both in terms of territories and in terms of infrastructures like railways and canals, or introduction of new plantation crops. So these, for instance, created conditions, special conditions for greater proliferation or incidence of diseases. For instance, during the construction works related to railways and canals, uh, there were large stagnant pools of water which remain for long periods of time, which, for instance, was very conducive to the spread, spread of malaria. Similarly, if you take the case of tea plantations, um, tea would need considerable water from time to time, but unlike rice, it does not like water standing in the field. And of course, many of us, when we think of tea, we think of tea grown in the hills of, say, Darjeeling or Munnar or Ooty, and we would wonder how would water stagnate in such a topology. But so in places like Assam, like where, so you'd be surprised to find tea on almost plain horizontal ground, and in fact in a nearby vicinity you will find even rice within a few kilometers. So there was the danger of water stagnating, and to avoid that, to drain that, so there had to be ditches which had to be dug on the edges. And so these ditches again were a source of stagnant water and malaria. So like that, in several ways, some of these so-called development projects themselves were very conducive to the disease, and also these infrastructures and new modes of transport like steamship or railways or other kinds of motorized transport enhance the greater movement of not only troops but also the people, so general travel or commerce or pilgrimage. So this again increased the rate at which diseases could be spread, through which they could be endemic, endemics could become epidemic. And so considering the totality of these factors, the poor conditions, the kind of development, the kind of investments made, the kind of resources spent for sanitary and other measures, the kind of local challenges faced. So considering all of these, so India was left far behind Europe and North America in tackling public health problems, especially these diseases. And in a set of next lectures, we will dealing with each of these diseases separately, one on smallpox, one on malaria, and so on. But today, we will close this lecture here. Thank you.